slots. All right, got it. From all relevant slot coordinators. Actually, we have national coordinators, so it's quite a decentralized process. But luckily, they all follow the same World Airport Slot Guidelines, meaning that they follow the same set of rules, which are unfortunately not fully specified. But what we do know is that there's a grandfathering policy. If you are an airline and you currently have the right to operate a flight, you basically keep those rights unless you cancel more than 20% of the flights associated with the rights. So you get rights for a slot series. So that's, let's say, a sequence of all slots, Monday morning, 9 a.m., departing from Charles de Gaulle during the entire flight season. So during the entire summer season of 2018. So only if you cancel more than 20% of flights, are the rights expiring and are they returned to the pool? And those will be available for newcomers or airlines that want to expand at the airport. Okay, obviously, when an airport builds a new runway or when an airline goes bankrupt or when slots are returned voluntarily, those are available for newcomers as well. But typically, it's quite difficult if you're an airline and you want to expand at a level 3 airport right now. They are awarded for free. So nice detail, there's no price. They're freely given away to carriers. Now, I guess it's obvious, but to me at least, it's super fascinating, this market. So we were talking about a scarce resource without a market-based mechanism to allocate it. Huge barrier to enter markets, so generating incumbency advantage. Current rules likely cause inefficiencies, not just economic, but you might have heard about ghost flights. So those are flights taking off empty or near empty just for the carrier to retain its slot right. So from an environmental standpoint, that's obviously less ideal as well. It's at the forefront of the policy debate. So the sustainability debate, noise, issues around noise and pollution and the reduction of flight movements, how to organize all of that. And then obviously the windfall profits for the firms. Now, there are a lot of, there's a lot of discussion surrounding the introduction of an auction for airport slots, but we're not sure what will happen in terms of welfare if you start auctioning slots for a couple of reasons. First of all, everyone uses the slot for their own purposes. So it's not that you're auctioning a product or an asset. It's like you're auctioning a productive license. That's the issue that has been raised already in Borenstein 1988. So for instance, if now the slot is used by Air France to offer a flight between Paris and Toulouse, if you allocate the slot now to Aeromexico, they're going to offer a flight to Mexico City, and we're not sure what are the welfare implications of that. Okay, so that's the first issue. But even if you set aside the use of the slot, even if you would have Aeromexico come in and take over the flight to Toulouse, we know in this industry that people care about perks associated with the network or network of a large carrier. For instance, better lounges, lower layover times, better connectivity, and so on, miles, things like that. So those have been documented in the industry. So even if you set aside this issue of how the slot is being used, we're not sure whether that weighs strong enough, like whether that outweighs any negative effects from the dominant carrier being larger and charging higher prices, basically. Okay, so those are some issues. And then the third issue is that the dominant firm might value the slots more. So if you now start introducing a market-based mechanism or an auction, they might buy more slots and, become larger. Markets might become more concentrated. And whether or not that's the case depends on, how much they value the slots versus the other firms. Okay, so that's exactly what I study in this paper. So I study the welfare impacts of the introduction of a market for slots, contributes to the literature on airline competition. In this case, I have a flight level analysis in oligopoly markets. I will explain why, but I add some substantial detail to models that have been used in the past, because I want to capture in a detailed way how much the firm will value the slot, and so requires a flight level model, but I'll provide more detail. I'm not the first to realize, obviously, that the current policy isn't ideal, and so there's a literature on feasible alternative mechanisms, also computational issues. I set those aside and I focus on what are the welfare impacts of the introduction of an efficient mechanism, okay, without thinking too much about the design of that mechanism. The second pillar of the paper that I find interesting to highlight is that it's more methodological. It's about the introduction of an auction in a market that currently doesn't have one. So in the empirical auction literature, we would observe a sample of bids, and then we impose an equilibrium model of bidding to recover values, and then we can simulate counterfactual auction rules and figure out what are the welfare impacts of those. Here, we don't have a comprehensive sample of bids, so we can't do that. So instead, I propose to define the value of the item, in this case, the value of the slot, in terms of the incremental profit that the firm can generate by using that slot. And then I use a model of demand and supply to estimate those values. Okay, so that's a more general thing that can be done in other settings as well. Also relating to studies on auctions with aftermarkets, because the firms care about which of their competitor wins the slot if they don't win it themselves. Those have been studied in the context of spectrum auctions, but this is, market for flights and with particularly large network benefits. All right, so I'll talk about the model first. There are two components. First component is defining the value of the slot to the firm, and the second component is characterizing equilibrium profits using demand and supply. Okay, now how much does airline A value slot S? First, note that a slot can only be used for one flight, and I'm going to denote it by FA of S. So that is the flight that airline A chooses to use the slot for. The second observation is that slots cannot be added to the system. So if you auction a slot, you also need to expire the rights of another flight. And that flight I'm going to denote by Fx of S. Okay, third observation, network optimization is complex. Slot constraints are often binding, also at destinations and other parts of the network. And I also see in my data that when you either add or subtract one flight, the rest of the network stays pretty stable, almost always doesn't change. So that's obviously a simplification that's going to help me define the value of the slot. But you will see in the next slide. So this slide, so I have to mention there's more information in the slides than I have time to talk about, and I will circulate the discussion paper very soon. It has a lot of detail on this exact issue of the full problem, which I'm going to simplify in the next slide. But here I'm just giving you a high level idea of what the full problem would look like. And then next slide are the simplifications. Now, all right, so to determine these flights, note that I mentioned that before, but firms will use the slot to offer different flights. So they will offer different FA of S. So that's why they care about the identity of the winner, even if they lose, right? So if my competitor is using the slot to fly to a destination where I generate a lot of profit, I dislike it more, and I would rather have one of my other competitors take over the slot to fly somewhere where I'm not competing, okay? So I need to figure out FA prime, so the use of flight of my competitors A prime. That's a bit difficult because it's based on private information to the carrier, right? So we have idiosyncratic cost draws. And so the full problem is difficult in that sense. And it would require, so you would need to figure out what are the incremental profits for me when I add any of my flights to my current network. And I need to figure out that for myself and for all of my competitors. And so that requires solving the equilibrium many, many times across all markets because then I have a model that has spillovers across markets and flights. Okay, so bottom line, the full problem cannot be reasonably solved in data. So I have about 120,000 flights, and then, you know, let's say 260 slots, and then that's just infeasible. And the second issue that I want to highlight here is that now we are in a setting that's a multi-object auction with interdependent values and allocative externalities. So we know that an efficient mechanism in the most general definition doesn't exist. Okay, so we have to rely on some approximations. So this is the definition that I use in the paper. So at the top, I'm showing you this approximation I mentioned before. So here, if script F, superscript S of A, that's the full flight network when airline A owns slot S. And I assume that the only difference between what happens when airline A owns the slot and airline A prime owns the slot are just those two flights that they will offer once they receive the slot. So FA of S and FA prime of S. Okay, so that's really this idea that the rest of the network isn't perturbed if I reallocate the flight from me to someone else. Just those two flights are going to be different. The value is defined as follows. Nu AS, so the value of slot S to airline A is the difference in total equilibrium profits, K star, between what happens when A itself gets the slot. So that's here the summation on the left, summing equilibrium profits across all flights by the same carrier, FA, when they are receiving the slot, right? So that's the term in brackets. Versus what happens if one of the competitors owns the slot. So that's the summation on the right. So summing my total equilibrium profits when the slot is allocated to one of my competitors. But then here I'm taking the worst case, so the maximum difference between those two units to account for the documented slot hoarding behavior in this industry. So firms or airlines are documented to use the slots inefficiently, to offer inefficiently many flights, just to avoid their competitors from coming in and taking over the slots and competing with them in their markets. Okay, so the max here is just to generate the largest slot hoarding incentive that you can generate. Okay, subject to, now are some approximations. The flight that is added is the one that generates the highest profit at baseline. The flight that is removed is the one that generates the least profit at baseline. And also important, firms have consistent beliefs. So I know the exact flight that my competitor would add, and I would also know the flight whose rights are expiring. Okay? So that's the definition I use going forward. The nice thing about it is that now values are private. So an efficient mechanism exists. I assume then that there is an efficient mechanism to allocate the slot to the firm that values it the most on the basis of this Nu AS. And then in the counterfactual, I simulate the market after we implement this allocation, and that allows me to estimate the welfare impacts of that. Some nice features are that I actually only care about ordinal preferences now, because I'm not going to simulate the exact bids. I'm just going to determine which firm has the highest Nu AS, reallocate the slot, solve the market equilibrium in terms of prices, and you know, figure out the welfare impacts, but I don't have to simulate the bids. And so that allows for some flexibility, right? So I allow for some unmodeled factors, fixed costs, additional synergies in the true value, as long as the identity of the firm that has the highest willingness to pay is the same as the firm that has the highest Nu AS. Okay, so that generates some flexibility. And I'm not saying that this is the exact slot value that they have, but at least, yeah, the ordering of firms is correct. That's the assumption. Yeah, the rest I kind of mentioned. So as you can see, I set the questions surrounding mechanism design, implementation, political feasibility. I set those aside for the next paper, and now I figure out, what if we implement this efficient mechanism? How will it affect the market? Okay. The second part of the model, it's about figuring out the equilibrium profits in the model of demand and supply. So that's more standard. I wanted to highlight one distinction with the literature. This is a flight level analysis. The literature often takes an itinerary level approach, partly also based on data limitations, but also, yeah, here I need to have a flight level analysis. I will explain you what it is. So for example, to determine the value of this slot S1 that's used by a carrier to offer a flight from Charles de Gaulle to Malpensa, I need to know equilibrium profits of that flight. So in this case, it's based on quantity, number of people on the plane, so number of seats that are filled, and the average price that they pay, regardless of the itinerary that the people are taking, right? So it could be that people are coming from JFK and they have a layover in Charles de Gaulle, and then they fly to Malpensa, and that's why they're on this flight. Some people might just be on the direct flight. Some people might be going from Charles de Gaulle to Malpensa, and then they go somewhere else, right? The flight itself is just going back and forth, and the operator needs to have slots for all slot-constrained airports on any potential itinerary. And so that's why I focus on this, the flight and the profits that are generated with that flight. I do care about connecting passengers. Obviously, like about 20% of passengers in Charles de Gaulle are actually connecting. So I do care about it. So I account for it in the market size. I include connectivity of the flight in the demand model. So specifically, I include how many flights by the same carrier are arriving in the departure airport. So here, how many flights by the same carrier are arriving in Charles de Gaulle within a window of 1.5 to 6 hours prior to the departure of this flight. So to account for potential connectivity that some people on this plane might care about, and the same at the destination airport. So how many flights by the same carrier or an code-sharing partner are departing from Malpensa within a certain window after the arrival of the flight in Malpensa. Okay, so that's how I account for connecting passengers. On the cost side, obviously, hub effects, network effects are important. The hub and spoke network is very popular for a reason. So we care about hub effects both at the origin and the destination in the cost model. All right, so a view of the data. This is data from global flight schedules. So that doesn't have quantities and prices, but it has the schedules of all the carriers globally in the summer season of 2018. My analysis is actually based on flights departing from Paris. So I'm going to focus on the carriers that are important in that data. So Air France, KLM, that's the most important carrier in the data. Here on the left, you see they do have this hub and spoke network. I'm plotting all the flights and also flights by code-sharing partners. Hub and spoke. Lufthansa is another flag carrier that's important in my data. Also hub and spoke. If you zoom in on Europe, you see that Air France has their hubs in Paris and then in Amsterdam. And Lufthansa also has hubs, but it has hubs from the perspective of flights departing from Paris at destinations. So Frankfurt and Munich. So both of them have hub and spoke network, but this motivates why we need to have network effects in cost at origin and destination, because both of them have the same strategy, but hubs in different places. The next two carriers, they have a point-to-point network. EasyJet and Vueling is partly probably motivated by constraints. They cannot grow so much as previously state-owned carriers because of the slot policy. So I think this is partly why they have the point-to-point network here. They arrived later, and so they couldn't expand as much as Lufthansa or Air France in one airport specifically. Okay. My computer is a bit slow because I'm running something. Okay. Now, this is the last slide of the model, just to summarize the model of demand and supply. To determine this K-star equilibrium profits of the firm A, as a function of the flight network, I take the Berry and Gia model, so random coefficient nested logit utility model, 2 latent consumer types. I add slot relevant flight characteristics. So most importantly, I think consumers prefer morning flights, or actually I include departure time preferences, which means that, well, turns out they prefer morning flights. And so in equilibrium, carriers can charge higher markups in morning flights. And that's a key driver for why slots in the morning are more valuable than in the middle of the day. So that's why that's there. Then, as I mentioned, they care about layovers, they care about delays and so on. So detailed flight level model. Then the dependence of the flight network, besides the economies of density and scope that have been included before, I include scheduling efficiencies. Firms, you know, the number, the spacing of departures of flights to any destination might generate some cost savings. Firms can share check-in desks. So in that sense, the flight is really placed in the network of the carrier. It generates spillovers across markets and flights. As I mentioned, I capture network effects at the origin and the destination of the flight. But as the network is not perturbed any further when the slot changes owner, the rest of the network is irrelevant. Okay, and that's useful because now you can see why you can do an airport by airport analysis. You can think about auctioning slots in one airport alone, but also you can see that it's scalable. So if you would have data from departures from multiple airports, you can have very detailed simulation of a multi-airport auction if you wanted to. So in my case, I have data from France, a flight level data set from the French civil aviation regulator, as 120,000 observations or flights taking off from Paris, Charles de Gaulle or Orly Airport during the summer season of 2018. Details flight level information, quantity, number of seats filled on the plane, price, average survey weighted lowest offered fare. So they call it a price robot, but we would call it an algorithm that every 2 days searches for prices of flights. So they have a large set of flight and booking characteristics. Every 2 days, they search for fares, offered fares. They take the lowest offered fare, and then they ask people at the airport how much did they actually pay for that flight, and then they generate survey weights, and so that gives you average survey weighted lowest offered fare. Wonderful data. I'm very grateful. There is one caveat due to the sampling process. They don't specifically select the departure time, and so they oversample cheaper flights in the middle of the day and they undersample more expensive flights in the morning. So fares are sometimes missing, and I use the best performing machine learning model to impute missing fares. So that's a random forest model. Then combined with the schedule data I already showed you, I have very detailed information about the flight. Aircraft type, number of seats, who owns the flight, and so on. And so I have a physics-based model of fuel consumption per seat. Not to brag, but this is also important, to have a good cost shifter. Now that we have a model with a lot of products per market, because it's a flight level model, and I have a very strong flight level cost shifter in the fuel consumption per seat. So that's available for 119 destinations, and so destinations that can be reached by direct flight from Orly or Charles de Gaulle, and 57 carriers. And those are selected. So there are actually more destinations and more carriers in these airports based on the selection that the DGAC, the regulator, did. Now, the carriers are not all the same, obviously. So here at the top, you can see the share of slots by Air France in Charles de Gaulle is 55%, about 30% of slots in Orly. Then if you take the Air France group, which also contains Transavia, which is the next carrier on this plot, they also have more than 55% of slots in Orly. And then quickly the other carriers become very small in terms of the number of flights that they offer from Paris. Here a plot with some variation in prices. So on the x-axis we have the departure hour, and on the y-axis the average fare of the flight in 100 euros. So you can see a lot of variation by departure hour, but I also made these 4 quadrants. At the top we have Charles de Gaulle, at the bottom we have Orly, so there are distinctions between those airports. Charles de Gaulle has more long-haul flights with wide-body aircraft. That, you know, both of them have international flights, but Charles de Gaulle has more long-haul flights. On the right, we have flights with an overnight status, so arriving the next day, more expensive. More of them depart from Charles de Gaulle, and they depart later in the day. The load factor, that's the share of the flight that's full. About 85% of seats are occupied on average. Similar to what we know in the US. So this is European data in the sense, right? At least departures from Europe. The literature focuses on US domestic markets, so it might be nice to see this, you know, by itself. Anyway, so the load factor is slightly lower, and slightly fewer flights sell out than what Williams find for US domestic markets, monopoly markets. Might be related to the slot constraints being more important here. In addition, the very few ghost flights, less than 1% of flights has less than 25 seats occupied, or less than 10% of seats occupied, so they're not very salient in this data. A final point on this slide that I wanted to mention is that I don't include a capacity constraint. Well, I did think about it, but in my simulations, I find that less than 1% of simulations also has a simulated quantity that exceeds the capacity of the flight. So that seems not so important to include here. Okay, estimation results. Even though I didn't show you the full model, I'm just going to show you some interesting snippets. Here, departure time preferences in a model where I include departure hour fixed effects. And so you can see if you squint a bit, so these are the coefficients. So you can see that, so the first one is 7 a.m., the second one is 8 a.m. So people prefer to leave around 8 a.m. Then they dislike to leave at 8 p.m. It's somewhat of a smooth pattern, but not really. And I actually think it's more reasonable if it would be smooth, because, you know, it's a bit strange that you prefer noon and you prefer it over 1 p.m., but you also prefer it over 11 a.m. And so instead, I thought about a smooth pattern that repeats every 24 hours. And I created this cosine variable. So I put it here, the first bullet point. So here is a variable of preferences that peak at 8 a.m., that repeat every 24 hours. And now the nice thing here is that this A hat thing, that's the amplitude, that's the coefficient in front of the variable that you can estimate, that determines by how much you prefer to leave at 8 a.m. versus 2 p.m. or simultaneously how much you dislike 8 p.m. versus 2 p.m. So you can also have now type-specific departure time preferences. I didn't manage to estimate type-specific departure time hour coefficients. Those were too many, but you can have these type-specific Gaussian preferences. I do model selection. This is a model that fits the data best. And so I keep on with the random coefficient on the Gaussian smooth departure time preferences. All right, so this gives the best overview of the model. It gives you all the coefficients, but there are better tables to look at, so I'll show you those instead. Price elasticities, so those are the two types. Type 1 is the business type, that's less price elastic. Type 2 is the leisure type. Then you have the population weighted price elasticity, similar to what's found in the literature, especially then the Williams flight level model, which makes sense. People like to, here, willingness to pay for connectivity is quite large. That's the variable I mentioned with, you know, the number of potential connections at the departure airport or at the arrival airport. Willingness to pay for departing, people willing to pay, like, okay, business type is willing to pay 30 euros to depart at 8 a.m. rather than 2 p.m. And the leisure type 16 euros. So I don't know if you have a thought about that. It might seem small, but actually that's 25% of the average profit per seat. So from the perspective of the airline, that's large. And so that's a major driver for why morning slots are more valuable than afternoon slots. Okay. Learner index, similar to prior literature as well, larger profit for long haul flights. And here what I wanted to point out is that I find learner index, so gross profit margin of 47%. Air France self-reports gross profit margin of 48% across all of its flights in 2018. So it's not targeted, but I would say it's a pretty nice fit of, well, at least the self-reported profit margin of Air France. Here are the values that you get when you apply the value definition that I showed you in the beginning. The counterfactual analysis is based on those four firms, so the largest four firms in the data: Air France, EasyJet, Vueling, and Lufthansa. And you can see on average value for, this is a weekly slot pair for one flight season, is €500,000. Much larger values for the dominant carrier. Okay, that's because it has substantial network effects both on the cost and the demand side. It has a larger slot hoarding motive, and it has a much larger network to select flights from when he's adding flights to the network. All of that combined means that, yeah, it does have a larger value. And that also means that if you start auctioning without any constraints in terms of quantity cap, the existing asymmetries in terms of the share of slots that they have will persist to some extent. I think that's a general finding. I think you will find the same thing if you start estimating slot values in Frankfurt, and you will find that Lufthansa has much larger value for it. And so this tells you something about how you could think about auction design. Here's a validation exercise. So on the right box plot, I'm just plotting slot prices. So the estimated slot values, assuming that firms get to keep the rights for 5 years, and what it would mean for prices then. I compare it with, in the middle, we have a sample of prices that have been paid for slots at Heathrow Airport. That's a very selected sample. So those are based only on about 25 prices that have been published in newspaper articles. It's definitely not a random sample of slots. And so, I'm not exactly trying to match the mean, but I just wanted to show you that the numbers I get with this approach based on, equilibrium profits and, what it will mean for slot values generates very reasonable results, even though I'm not saying that I have to perfectly match these moments. On the left, also very similar numbers. Those are obtained by consultancy, aviation economics, based on a random sample of slots at Heathrow, but I'm not sure by what methodology. So bottom line, generating reasonable slot values by these measures. Now, what determines the value of a slot? Regressing slot values on slot characteristics, carrier characteristics. Some takeaways, but let me highlight here, dominant carrier in global hub. So that's Air France. So Air France has 50% larger value than other carriers, conditioning on the other characteristics. And that's like the same magnitude of increasing the distance of the flight by 1 standard deviation or increasing the capacity of the aircraft by 1 standard deviation. And so that's a huge effect. So that's a huge asymmetry in that sense. All right. Now we can see what would happen if we start implementing an efficient mechanism. Here I'm showing you a table with the welfare estimates, the welfare effects of auctioning each slot once. So I did mention that, but a slot in this analysis is just a combination of a departure hour, departure day, and departure airport. Okay, so a bit larger categories than the actual slot, which is like a 5-minute departure time. All right, so here if you auction the slot, each slot once, so we have 216 slots, the effect is large and positive. So the welfare change, 96 million increase in total welfare, compensating variation negative. So consumers are also better off, 70 million gain in consumer surplus. The variable profits of firms that are participating, so those are the 4 firms here that are participating in the auction, Air France, Lufthansa, Vueling, and EasyJet, goes up. Note that here they don't have to pay a price, right? Because, you know, the price they would have to pay depends on the mechanism that I didn't specify. And then, you know, here it's not relevant because it would be coming to the budget of the auctioneer. So their variable profits increase, but, you know, depending on the mechanism, they might still be worse off, you know, if they have to start paying for their slots. And then the non-bidding firms, they are slightly hurt because now they had some value generating slots that are being taken away from them and they can't participate in the auction. Yeah, I also have other results in the paper that I'm going to be circulating soon, where you encourage also the very small firms to participate. So that's interesting. Usually you think about set-asides or bidder subsidies, and then you would see that they take over a lot of slots from Air France. Yeah, I'll mention something about that in the next slide, but it's not necessarily desirable from the perspective of the consumer. As I mentioned, because the dominant firm values the slots more, the asymmetries in that we see here, the column pre-auction, the share of slots that Air France owned, 73% of the slots that are being 73% of the slots that the 4 firms own are owned by Air France, and the same base case, that's the simple auction that I show you in the previous slide. You get a similar share of slots being owned by well, similar proportions of slot ownership. In the last column, I show you what happens if you do install a quantity cap that restricts the share of slots that a firm can win in the auction. And here I show you the effect of the quantity cap in terms of welfare, and you can actually see, okay, welfare still goes up, but it increases by much less. So we had 90-something million increase. Now we only have a 50 million increase in consumer surplus, in welfare, and only a 30 million increase in consumer surplus. So that is I think it's very interesting and very somewhat counterintuitive. So consumers value the dominant firm staying larger, and it's actually not so surprising if you know the literature, because it has been documented that consumers care about perks associated with the network of the airlines. And so here it's coming out of my structural analysis as well, and it's carrying through in the analysis of the welfare effects, that it's not necessarily a good idea to install quantity caps. I will have to wrap up soon, and so I'm not going to show you the complementarities, but let me just summarize that if you already package slots into weekly slot pairs, so pairs stand for arrival and departure slot pair at the departure airport, that obviously captures a lot of the complementarity between slots. You know, the arrival and departure slots at the departure airport have large complementarity. But there I find limited complementarity between packages of weekly slot pairs, setting aside the choice of flight. Only for the very small carriers that use the slots to fly through to small destinations or destinations with few flights are there benefits from slot packages. Yeah. So let me conclude. In general, I propose this ex-ante analysis of introducing a market-based mechanism in a market that currently doesn't have one. So rather than recovering costs and values from equilibrium bids, I define them in terms of equilibrium profits that you can estimate from a demand and supply model of the industry. I believe I've shown that this gives reasonable results, and there are more results in the paper. And then empirically, I find that creating a market for slots reallocates most of the slots. The dominant carrier stays large as the network benefits carry through in the slot values. The auctions increase welfare, increase consumer surplus. Quantity caps reduce the consumer surplus relative to auctions without a quantity cap by lowering the network gains of the dominant firm. And I didn't mention that, but the proceeds of auctioning these like 10% of slots are similar to a large spectrum auction. So about 2.2 billion euros in revenue will be generated. And I leave it here. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Marleen. So we'll move straight to the discussion then by Peter Cramton. So hopefully you can...
Yes. Sharing now.
Okay. Okay, I can see that. That's great. Okay, please go ahead.
Let's see.
Yeah.
There. Good. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be able to discuss this paper. It is a fantastic paper that Marleen has written. She's been extremely careful and detailed in her empirical analysis using state-of-the-art techniques with a wonderful data set. So there is much to like here, and I'm sure that all of you will enjoy reading the paper, as I have. Now, so let me just say a few words about the key idea, which should be obvious to every economist in the world. We need to limit the air slots to the capacity of the airport. Seems clear. Physical reality is actually important. And we need to price congestion. We've got this amazing tool in our economics toolkit to manage congestion with prices, resulting in the maximization of social welfare. So, this seems obvious. But yet we don't do that. And we haven't done it for, this was recognized as an important issue for many, many decades, and we still haven't done it. It's obvious that there's enormous costs of delay to passengers, to labor, the pilots, flight attendants, everyone else, and the capital equipment, which is enormously expensive. So why don't we fix this problem? Well, it got so bad in the United States that in 2007, the White House organized a group of people like me to get together and address the problem. So we met, and we came up with a nice market for air slots. And in 2008, at the instruction of the White House, effectively to the head of transportation, directing then the FAA, our regulator of airports, to do an auction. And I was hired to design and implement the auction. I did that. And then 2 weeks before the first auction of the New York City air slots, the auction was canceled, and canceled permanently. Congress had passed a law banning auctions in the United States. So, clearly there's some challenges here. So what this paper does is the important first step, which is empirically estimating what the consequence of an efficient market might be, and in particular, what the value is in social welfare to addressing the problem. So let me, and then the second paper, which has not yet been written, is, what's the market design? And this is something that I've thought about for a long time, obviously. My thinking has evolved enormously. And so what I'm going to do in my last minutes is share what I think that design is. And then I actually believe that it solves the big challenge, which is what? Well, I just turned to my heroes, Milton Friedman, Tyranny of the Status Quo. This is the problem of market design. Market design is not about thinking of really good ideas. It's about getting those good ideas implemented. That is the problem. It's getting governments from doing things that are really stupid. That's our job. And it's a hard job. You have to work very hard. And so we should do as Milton Friedman instructs, which is develop plans so that when the crisis occurs and there's somehow the door opens a little bit, there's an opportunity for innovation, we've got the solution. And then the second part of the challenge is that the regulation is by and large designed for the benefit of the industry. It's not designed for the consumers, and that's a big problem too. Okay, so how are we going to overcome these challenges? Well, with an effective design. And the effective design starts with what we have to do: fix the quantity of slots to airport capacity. Now, here's the wrinkle: is capacity is not a fixed number. It depends upon the weather. So when you have a weather event, then which happens to all airports, your capacity is reduced, and it can be reduced substantially. It can be reduced to zero, but more typically, when you have fog or cloud cover and limited visibility, the capacity is dropped to 80%. Now, these airports like Chicago and New York, and I suspect Paris and London and Frankfurt are not operating at 80% so that they can handle clouds. They're operating at like 96% so that they can be used much of the time at full capacity, and then there's just simply delay when there's weather-induced events. And then they have this barter system with which to manage the congestion that gets impossibly large during the weather events. So you need to take that into consideration. The next thing is, so how do we auction the slots? So to me, I actually have pretty firm ideas now about how this should be done. And they're detailed. It's essentially you auction 100% of the slots. You use this flow trading approach, which is described in a finance paper that I've done with my co-authors and a electricity market design paper that I've done with many co-authors. And it basically involves gradual trade and frequent batch auctions for portfolios of whatever the commodity is. In this case, it's air slots. It uses convex optimization to determine unique prices and quantities that maximize as-bid social welfare. The participants express preferences for portfolios using piecewise linear downward sloping demand curves. Demand and supply are net demand curves, so demand and supply are treated perfectly symmetrically. This is feasible for any level of time and locational granularity of any commodity. It doesn't matter whether it's electricity, communications, transportation, all is fine. And it's just the beauty of convex optimization. We can solve these very large problems extremely quickly, finding unique prices and quantities. The prices are the beautiful linear prices that economists love and use in serious markets. The 4 products for each slot, which it might be, you can do a 5-minute interval or a 15-minute interval, whatever you want. The granularity is can be handled. Effectively, you've got takeoff and landing slots. And it's because we can handle granularity, we can handle them separately. So even though they're very strong complements. But it's important to have priority pricing as well. So you've got 2 qualities, premium and regular. And you ration the regular before you ration any premium. And this is important because I might have a shuttle from Washington, D.C. to New York City that runs every hour. And when the weather turns bad, what I want to do is I want to cancel 20% of my flights to be consistent with the capacity of the airport. And so I actually want to do that. So I'm actually happy to buy regular slots and save a lot of money. And my customers, even though they have they're business travelers, they love the fact that there's a flight every half an hour to because there's a second carrier that's doing the 30-minute flight, the rather than on the hour flights. And the whole thing works just beautifully. And here's the biggest thing, the biggest point: revenue neutral. Revenue is recycled to the prior owners. So the owners own everything. So you imagine they actually have a sort of a property right for this, and then they're just trading it. We're just altering parties' positions. And Marleen's analysis is absolutely wonderful to help us model what that would look like. This is what it looks like in electricity. Electricity is, we have to balance supply and demand every second. So we can't screw up the things like we do in air slots and transportation and water and every other commodity sector. We have to do it right. And so, but yet we don't do it perfectly. We do it right in the physical market. We have to balance supply and demand. But this is actually a view of the forward market that I'm proposing that doesn't yet exist. But it's based on modeling the entire system and identifying prices, and sort of gives you a glimpse of what granularity in prices for a commodity looks like. And you can see there's lots of prices. Oh boy, that's scary. Just like in Europe, they're scared about nodal pricing, but it's not scary at all. This is Texas, and in Texas, in the summertime, it's expensive to generate. Electricity is really expensive in those peak moments in the summertime, which occur by time of day, 3 to 5 p.m. pretty much every day. And then as you get closer to real time, the pricing becomes more volatile. quite naturally because parties lose options, but the exact same thing can be done for air slots. So with that, I stop.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks so much for that nice discussion. So we have 3 minutes of the official time left. So perhaps I'll allow Marleen to respond to some of that. And then what I can do then is open the floor to everyone else. We can stay on a little bit after 4 o'clock or whatever time zone you're in, after the hour, if anyone wants to hang back and chat a bit. So yeah, so Marleen, please go ahead and take a moment to respond.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks for the discussion. Yeah, as I said, the actual design is interesting and requires smart people like you and smart approaches like that to get it right. So in terms of the flow trading approach, that sounds very interesting, and see if we can apply it to slots as well. I think one difficulty might be that the rest of the slots, unless you convince everyone to participate, like the rest of the slots, like the matching arrival slots, are still being awarded in the usual timeline, like twice per year. You need to make sure that you have your matching arrival slot. So but otherwise I like the idea of it's more like a secondary market that makes sure that you use the rights efficiently, and I'm all in favor of having a efficient secondary market. And so yeah, sounds like a good idea to figure this out for airport slots as well. I'll leave my remaining minute to see if someone else wants to contribute.
Yeah, and what I'll do now is I'll just stop the recording. So yeah, we can let it go a little more informal now that we're kind of finished the formal part.
Okay, thank you so much.